He thought inheritance was a birthright until she read the clause that erased his name. He smirked at the will reading and said, "Skip to the good part." So she did, right over his legacy. A sealed letter, a forgotten codicil, a courtroom stunned into silence. And just when the damage seemed irreversible, his sister, the family's long-lost witness, walks through the door. Some inherit money, others inherit silence. Only one rewrites the story. The waiting room smelled like paper and polished wood, clean, cold, impersonal. Beige walls, framed degree certificates, and two antiquated couches so upright they might pry your ribs apart if you slouched. A muted chandelier dangled above, its crystal prisms catching the dim light like distant stars in a cloudy sky. That chandelier was the only flourish in this otherwise clinical space, as if someone thought law should feel like an event, and not like bureaucracy. I sat in the middle couch, my purse balanced on my lap, fingers curled around a small folded envelope I'd pressed into my coat pocket. The fabric pressed taut across it, its contents shifting with every heartbeat. A letter to Grayson. One I wasn't yet ready to deliver. One I might never say out loud. But for tonight, it felt necessary to carry it like a secret lifeline. There were 6 of us waiting. I counted them, 3 women, 2 men, and one figure leaning forward so far it seemed he expected to topple onto the coffee table at any moment. All strangers, all suddenly family, all holding their last chance to hear the words that might define them. The attorney's assistant emerged in a charcoal suit, name badge reading Simpson. Her expression was polite but manageable, like a shop clerk who'd seen too many wills that disinherited grandchildren. She murmured something about being right on schedule and beckoned us forward in order of age, oldest first. I stood, clutching my purse with both hands as if my posture alone might keep me whole, against grief, against inheritance, against expectations. I stepped into the small conference room, the lighting harsher inside, fluorescent overhead, revealing every wrinkle, every doubt. A dark mahogany table ran lengthwise, chairs arrayed around it like jurors in slow motion. At the head, a man in a gray suit, tall enough to cast a long shadow even seated, organized papers in front of him. His name tag said Attorney Wheeler. Grayson hovered beside me, a perfunctory nod in greeting. His hair was neat, his tie straight. He appeared composed, but I knew those well-pressed clothes didn't reflect anything real. Not the tension wedged between us for years. Not the pressures I'd absorbed and projected. Not the cold calculation I glimpsed now in his eyes. Wheeler glanced at his watch, lifted his chin, and began reading in that slow, professional voice. "We are gathered here today to read the last will and testament of Victor Halbridge." My heart clenched at hearing Victor's name. The man who had taken my laughter, my agency, and my voice for decades. That I survived him was my first victory, one I called strength, but now felt more like survival fatigue. He described assets, properties scattered across 2 states, savings accounts, retirement portfolios. He paused between each enumeration, allowing the weight to settle in the room, like dust falling in a sealed box. Grayson's gaze flicked to me, a slight, unspoken dare. I held his eyes steady, though inside my chest felt hollow and heavy. When Wheeler reached a clause about physical possessions, he set aside the documents and began listing heirlooms. Tiffany vase, grandfather's pocket watch, the mahogany bookcase from the study. Oh. Grayson shifted. Skip to the good part. His voice cracked the tension, not loud enough to startle, but precise enough to draw it like a scalpel. Silence snapped around us so fast I could hear the air shatter. I pictured every pair of eyes drifting to him, the polished gaze of Wheeler, the assistants leaning forward, the distant relatives tightening in their seats. And, worst of all, I felt the immediate stab of betrayal stretch through me. I stayed seated. I didn't smile. I didn't hide my hurt. I kept the letter pressed against my ribs like armor. Wheeler paused, lips parted, expression smooth but searching. "The terms of the will are legally binding," he said, voice clipping, then slower. "Grayson is entitled?" 20 years earlier, I stood in the kitchen with a spatula in my hand, trying to get Grayson to talk about school. He was 8 then, turning the corner at adolescence, just quiet enough to slip past my fingers like smoke. He said nothing, just stared, and I realized I had trained him to silence. I had traded questions for calm. I had equated peace with obedience. Then I heard Victor behind me, draped over the doorway. He said something like, "Leave him be. He'll talk when he needs to." Just like that, a lesson, a habit, a division. Grayson didn't need permission to be quiet. He needed only confirmation. Back in the room, I swallowed. My fingers flexed around the envelope's edges. I remembered that younger me in the kitchen, desperate to be heard, and I realized how far I drifted from my own voice. Grayson is entitled to one property, the cabin at Big Pine Lake. Wheeler continued. The cabin, a place of summer freedom. I pictured it, the way the sunlight pooled in the living room, the smell of pine drifting off the porch, the laughter of family dinners, before Victor brought stakes into it, before he made ownership a game, before I silenced Arden and built this image of perfect inheritance. Silence again. Someone shifted behind me. I turned slightly. Lucinda, my sister-in-law, brows furrowed. She glanced at me. Her expression asked a question I wasn't ready to answer. Wheeler cleared his throat. All remaining assets are to be divided equally between the two children. He paused, breath catching. He cleared his throat again, louder, practiced. He glanced at Grayson, at me, then back to the papers. Unless otherwise noted. That phrase echoed in my mind. I thought of the envelope, the private codicil Victor had written, but which nobody else had ever seen. Something about silence, obedience, and legacy. Something quietly powerful. Something I carried in my pocket. And I thought of Grayson again. The phrase he'd used. The way he'd dismissed words as if they were meaningless. As if history, values, voice, none of it mattered unless labels fit neatly at the end. I pressed my hand into my purse. It curled around the envelope. I thought of what silence cost me, and what silence had cost us both. Wheeler put the papers down, looked at me. Annabeth Hallbridge? I didn't flinch. I cleared my throat. I believe there is one part that Victor wanted me to read aloud. A ripple spread. Grayson leaned forward. The assembled group leaned in. I slid the envelope from my coat. Wheeler's voice, cool and procedural, filled the room again. He moved with the rhythm of a man who had read hundreds of wills, each line delivered like a measured drop of water on stone. The estate includes 4 parcels of real property: the family residence at Sycamore Lane, the cabin on Big Pine Lake, the duplex in Danvers, and the rural tract known as the Northfield Lot. Personal assets include 2 vehicles, 1 boat, multiple investment portfolios, and household heirlooms to be detailed further. I watched Grayson's fingers tap his thigh in precise, patient intervals, an affectation he picked up from Victor. He never rushed forward unless he was certain the door would swing open at his command. Now, I saw his smile tighten at the corners as each clause ticked forward without his name. The locket around my neck shifted, almost involuntarily as I reached to clutch it. A delicate gold oval. Inside, a black and white photo of my mother. Hair pulled back, eyes determined, mouth firm. She gave it to me on my wedding day. "Keep this near your heart," she said, "for when yours feels far away." Victor hadn't wanted me to wear it at the ceremony. "Too old-fashioned," he said, "distracts from the neckline." I wore it anyway, under my gown, quietly. That was always the deal with Victor. Obedience in public, defiance in private. But the longer we were married, the less space there was for even that. His corrections came dressed as concern. "Don't say it like that, Annabeth. Let me do the talking. You're just tired. Get some rest." What started as occasional dismissals grew into silences too loud to ignore. Conversations I wasn't invited to. Finances I wasn't trusted with. He took over the account slowly. A new password here, a changed policy there. "Easier for both of us," he said. "Less for you to worry about." I didn't argue, at least not aloud, but inside me something began to dim. Even when I did ask questions about his long absences, about Arden's sudden outbursts, he'd laugh. "You always overthink things, Beth. Not everything is a plot." And maybe I believed that for a while. Maybe I believed keeping peace was more valuable than pushing for truth, until the house started to feel like a museum curated by someone else. Wheeler turned a page. "The heirlooms are divided as follows," he said, pausing to lift a separate sheet. "The Tiffany vase to Lucinda, the mahogany desk to Grayson, the Monet print from the master bedroom to Arden Hallbridge, if contact can be made." Lucinda sat 2 seats over from me, her back unusually straight, lips slightly parted, not in objection but in surprise. She looked at me sideways, a quick, curious glance, noticing something in me she hadn't expected. I met her gaze and held it a moment longer than usual. She blinked first. Grayson snorted, barely masking it as a cough. "Prince?" he muttered, just loud enough for me to hear. "She gets art, I get furniture. Cute." His voice wasn't angry, just bored, as if inheritance were a game he'd already won. His face betrayed nothing but amusement. I gripped the locket tighter. Wheeler continued, listing stocks, bonds, and minor holdings. His voice faded for a moment in my head, replaced by the memory of Victor explaining our mortgage to a banker, while I stood 2 feet away, excluded from the conversation. "She doesn't need the details," he said once. "She's more of a creative soul." I hadn't written a single poem in 23 years. It was Lucinda who surprised me again. When Wheeler paused to adjust his glasses, she leaned slightly in my direction. "You holding up?" she whispered. I nodded, just taking it in. "You seem different." I didn't answer. But she wasn't wrong. I was different, not because Victor was gone, but because I had decided to stop measuring my value against his absence. Wheeler cleared his throat again. "There is an additional component to this will. A private codicil, unregistered but legally binding, was submitted to my office 1 week before Victor Halbridge's death." I froze. The room stirred. Pages rustled. Someone coughed. Grayson's attention snapped back to the center of the table. "A private codicil?" he asked, sharp now. "What does that mean?" Wheeler looked at me, and I understood. This part was mine to read. I had known this day was coming. Victor, in a rare moment of twisted honesty, had handed me a sealed envelope the day before he died. "You'll know when to use it," he'd said. His voice was weak, but his gaze was precise. "When he stops pretending." It wasn't a confession. It was a dare. I slipped my hand inside my purse and pulled out the envelope, the same one I'd carried pressed against my chest all morning. I set it on the table. Wheeler nodded. "The language in this document overrides specific distribution clauses," he said, "namely, with respect to trust allocations and decision-making authority." Grayson leaned forward. "What the hell does that mean?" I broke the seal. Inside was a single typed page, Victor's language crisp, confident, condescending, but also revealing. I read the first line aloud. "To my wife Annabeth, I leave the final say." Wheeler took the page, read the rest silently, then turned it toward the assembled group. "It stipulates that any beneficiary who attempts to pressure, belittle, or coerce the executor during the reading shall forfeit their right to claim discretionary assets." Silence fell like a trap snapping shut. Grayson's mouth twitched. "Are you kidding me?" Wheeler remained composed. "This codicil was signed, witnessed, and notarized. It is valid and enforceable." Lucinda looked stunned. I didn't. I sat still. Locket open now, my mother's face looking out. She'd once told me, "You don't have to yell to be heard, you just have to mean it." And this time, I did. The house sat like a monument no one had asked to build. After Victor's death, the Sycamore Lane residence had been untouched for weeks. The grass grew high, licking at the porch steps. Dead leaves gathered in the corners of windowsills. The shutters trembled in the wind, whispering things I wasn't ready to hear. I unlocked the front door with a key that still carried his initials on a brass tag. VH, etched clean and sharp, like everything else about him. I hadn't been back since the ambulance pulled away. The first thing I noticed was the quiet, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that hung like dust in still air. The living room looked exactly as he'd left it. Armchair angled just so toward the television. Fireplace empty, cold. That same navy throw draped across the back cushion, unused but perfectly folded. It all felt preserved, like a museum of curated memory. I stepped in slowly, shoes tapping against the hardwood that creaked in familiar protest. The air smelled faintly of cedar and something more bitter, papers maybe, or the remnants of an old cologne Victor never stopped wearing, even after his body had given up trying to impress anyone. The drawers in the hallway buffet were locked. I tried each one anyway, nothing budged. He'd always kept a heavy hand on things he didn't want disturbed. Upstairs, the guest room still carried the floral wallpaper I'd chosen in 1989. The bedspread had faded, but it hadn't shifted. The mirror, however, was covered with a sheet. I pulled it back, saw my reflection, and barely recognized the woman staring back. My hair thinner, lines deeper. But something else, too. A flicker of awareness in the eyes. A woman who wasn't finished. I turned down the hallway, toward the attic stairs. Victor had rarely allowed me up there. Claimed the steps were loose. Said it was too dusty, too cluttered. Nothing worth looking at, he'd once muttered. But I climbed them now, one at a time. They didn't creak as much as I expected. The attic smelled like old paper and varnish. Light filtered in through the small, round window, its glass smudged with time. Dust swirled in the beam like it had been waiting. Boxes lined the left wall, labeled in Victor's tidy print. Receipts, family photos, MISC. But one box sat apart beneath an old quilt chest. No label. I knelt slowly, pulled it out. Inside were 4 hardback journals, edges worn, pages yellowing. Each one bore the same name in looping cursive. Caroline Halbridge, Victor's mother. I opened the first journal carefully, pages crackling as they turned. April 2nd, 1953. Victor came home late again, said it was business. Didn't look at me when he spoke. I asked if he'd seen my sister's baby. He said, "Your voice makes things sound like emergencies." I read the words 3 times, not just because they felt familiar, but because they echoed. Down the decades, across marriages, into the very heart of my own silences. Caroline wrote pages upon pages, not angry rants, but quiet observations, little humiliations, subtle erasures. He moved the checkbook again. He said I imagined it. He kissed me goodnight and locked the study after I mentioned our joint savings. The ink changed color over time, but the patterns didn't. She chronicled them all. I kept reading until I lost track of time, until the light shifted from silver to gold and I hadn't moved in hours. One entry struck so close I felt breathless. He told Victor that women shouldn't sign for property. They'll only give it away. And now Victor says it too. I wonder if belief is inherited or taught. I closed the journal slowly. My thumb rested on the edge of the page, reluctant to leave it behind. Caroline had lived in this house, had whispered her truth into pages hidden under floorboards and linen chests, and the house had remembered even when the people didn't. I leaned back against a trunk and let my eyes drift toward the window. Light broke through it in a long shaft, illuminating dust motes like golden ghosts. They moved slowly, beautifully, as if even time had softened its cruelty here. Victor had controlled the narrative for decades, in this house, in our marriage, in the stories we told at family dinners. But here, in this attic, there was another voice. One he hadn't managed to silence. One he'd maybe never known existed. And now it belonged to me. I stood slowly, cradling the journals like they were sacred. I carried them downstairs, back into the living room. I sat on the edge of his chair, not to honor him, but to face the space he'd occupied so fully, and I read one more entry aloud. I sometimes wonder what I'll be remembered for. Silence, most likely, but I hope, somewhere, someone sees the quiet not as weakness, but as witness. I closed the book and pressed it to my chest. The house creaked around me, not in protest this time, but in agreement. It had remembered, and so would I. Wheeler cleared his throat and lifted a second stack of pages, thicker than the first. "Now," he said, "we move into the disbursement clauses related to discretionary trusts and direct beneficiary transfers." Grayson shifted in his seat, leaning forward like a man finally approaching the altar. His expression was smooth, but I could see it. The quiet anticipation in the way his fingers curled slightly, how his right foot tapped just once against the floor. He was waiting for his reward. Wheeler continued reading in that practiced, sterile cadence. To Grayson Hallbridge, my only son, I leave. He paused, adjusting his glasses. The remainder of any assets not explicitly allocated, subject to compliance with all prior conditions and ethical constraints established herein. Silence. Grayson blinked, his mouth opening slightly. I'm sorry, what? Wheeler remained steady. The language was Victor's. Any unassigned holdings are reserved under a discretionary clause. However, that clause is tied to a stipulation, added in the private codicil. He reached for the sealed document I'd provided earlier, already opened and marked. Clause 17C. Wheeler read aloud, any prior financial transfer made under the suggestion, influence, or pressure of any party, if deemed coercive, invalidates said party's claim to discretionary inheritance. Grayson sat back in his chair like the air had thinned. That's not enforceable. Wheeler didn't flinch. It's been reviewed and accepted by probate. I watched my son then, watched as confusion etched across his carefully curated expression. This wasn't rage yet. It was disbelief, the kind that festers before it erupts. You can't be serious, he muttered. And I saw him, really saw him. The little boy Victor used to call my sharp one, the teenager who never cried, even when he fractured his wrist, the man who gave the eulogy at his father's funeral without mentioning my name once. He hadn't grown into this man. He'd been raised for it. I remember the first time I saw the mirror. Grayson was 16, standing in the hallway, arms crossed, lips pursed. I'd just asked him to help Arden clean out the garage. It was a Saturday, a warm one. He said no. You know that's not my job, he replied. She's the messy one. She's your sister. He didn't answer right away. Then he said it. You were always a shadow, Mom. Don't try to step into the light now. I'd slapped him, not hard, not loudly, but enough that the silence after rang louder than any shouting could have. Victor didn't even ask what had happened. He came home, saw Grayson sulking, saw me cleaning the kitchen with tears half dried on my cheek. Later that night, Victor said, "Boys test boundaries. Let him grow." But I hadn't seen growth. I'd seen a replication. In the room now, Grayson stared at Wheeler like the lawyer was the one who'd twisted the knife. This wasn't the plan, he said. Dad always said I'd handle the financial side. I tilted my head. He also said I couldn't balance a checkbook, didn't make it true. Grayson turned to me fully then. You think this is justice? Rewriting his wishes because you had a good cry with a lawyer? You think you know what he wanted? I asked, quieter. You think you understood the man who silenced us all? He laughed once, bitter. You want to play righteous now? After all the years you said nothing. You handled the holidays, the casseroles, the seating charts. I handled the rest. You handled Dad's finances, I said, not his soul. He smirked. Neither did you. Wheeler coughed. If I may. No, Grayson cut in. Let her finish. She's earned her drama, apparently. I stared at him. I stayed, I said. Even when he dismissed me, even when he shut Arden out, even when you looked at me like I was furniture. I stayed because I thought I was protecting something. He didn't blink. I know better now, I added. He leaned forward, voice low. You're rewriting history. No, I said. I'm remembering it. Finally. There's a difference between regret and accountability. For years I sat in rooms where Victor spoke for me. Grayson watched and learned how to interrupt without raising his voice, how to dominate with silence. When I'd question his tone, he'd smile and call me sensitive. I never thought that word would be the wound that cut deepest, but it was. Sensitive, as if care was a weakness, as if softness disqualified me from ownership. I gave that boy everything, and he used my love as evidence against me. Now he sat across from me, eyes gleaming with disbelief and insult. But for once I didn't flinch. I looked to Wheeler. Continue, please. Wheeler turned the page. The codicil grants final trust authority to Annabeth Hallbridge, with freedom to revise allocations if coercion is identified or documented. This includes, but is not limited to, property, investment accounts, and long-term funds. Grayson stared at me. "This isn't you," he said. "You're not this person." I wasn't. The knock came soft but certain just after 3 in the afternoon. I had been sitting by the window in the kitchen, a lukewarm mug of chamomile untouched beside me. The morning had stretched into hours of silence after the reading, as if the house itself had swallowed the shock. When I opened the door, Lucinda stood there, coat unbuttoned, eyes unsure. "Didn't think you'd be up for company," she said. "I wasn't," I replied, "until I was." She followed me inside, her heels quiet on the hardwood. I gestured to the kitchen table and poured her a cup of tea. She took it without a word. For a while, we just sat. The silence wasn't heavy. It was watchful, like something between us had changed and we were both feeling around for the shape of it. Finally, Lucinda broke the quiet. "I have to say, you were something else yesterday." I raised an eyebrow. "What does that mean?" "I've known you 30 years, Annabeth. I've seen you host Easter brunches with a smile stretched so tight I thought your face would split. I've watched Victor walk all over your voice like it was part of the carpet. But yesterday?" She paused. "Yesterday you didn't flinch." "I've done enough of that for one lifetime," I said. She nodded, sipping slowly. Then, as if summoning courage from the bottom of her mug, she spoke again. "He tried to do it to me, too." "Victor," I blinked. "What?" Lucinda stared into the steam. "Back in 1991, after Harold passed, I was still a mess. And Victor, he showed up to help. Said he'd take care of the paperwork, the insurance, the estate filings. It sounded kind at first. I let him. Then I realized he'd moved funds from my account into something he called a temporary hold. Said it was for tax reasons, wouldn't give me passwords, told me not to worry." I sat back, stunned. "Why didn't you say anything?" "I tried," she said. "To you, once, at that 4th of July cookout." I remembered, vaguely. She'd cornered me near the lemonade stand, mentioned something about Victor being a little too helpful. I had smiled, nodded, changed the subject. "I thought you were just being dramatic," I admitted. Lucinda shrugged. "I thought I was too." We both laughed, but it wasn't humor. It was recognition. "I think part of me resented you," I said. "After Harold died, you looked free, lighter. I envied it. I convinced myself you were reckless." "And I thought you were trapped," she replied. "Which of course you were. We both were, just in different ways." I looked down at the tea between my palms. "He sabotaged my friendships." Lucinda looked up. "I used to have people," I said. "Before the kids, before Victor turned every dinner party into a subtle humiliation. He'd criticize my cooking with a smile, correct my stories mid-sentence. After a while, people stopped calling, or I stopped answering. I don't know which came first." Lucinda's face softened. "I let it happen," I said. "Because he did it in whispers, because he never hit me, because I thought as long as I had a house and the kids were fed, I couldn't call it abuse." "Control doesn't need bruises," Lucinda said. "It just needs silence." There it was, the thing I'd been circling for months, maybe years. I stood and reached for the sugar jar, anything to keep my hands moving. My fingers brushed the porcelain lid. It slipped, crashed, shattered against the tile in an explosion of ceramic. We both jumped. Lucinda leaned down to help. I knelt too, sweeping pieces into a napkin. One sharp shard cut my thumb, and a thin bead of blood rose to the surface. Lucinda handed me a tissue. We looked at the mess between us. "That's the first time anything's broken in this house in years," I said. She smirked. "Then it's about time something did." I sat back against the cabinets, pressing the tissue to my thumb. "I kept telling myself I was keeping the peace," I said, "but peace shouldn't cost your voice." Lucinda settled beside me, her legs stretched out like we were kids hiding from chores. "I think Victor needed control like oxygen," she said. "He couldn't handle not being the smartest man in the room. He just didn't realize that the women he tried to outmaneuver were playing a longer game. He'd be furious if he knew I changed the terms." "Or maybe he knew you would," she said. "Maybe that's why he gave you the codicil, a final test." "I'm done passing tests," I said. We sat there for a while, floor cold beneath us, the silence between us changed again. No longer distant, no longer performative. Just quiet. Real. Lucinda stood first, brushing off her slacks. "I'll bring by a new sugar jar next week." "Don't bother," I said. "I like the sound of things breaking." She laughed. "Well, in that case, maybe I'll just bring more tea." She moved toward the door, but paused before opening it. "I know I didn't help you before," she said, "and I know I helped him more than I should have." "You don't owe me an apology," I said, "but if you're offering yourself now, as someone who sees it all clearly, I'll take that." She smiled, and for once it didn't feel rehearsed. "Then I'll see you soon." And she left. I turned back toward the kitchen, broken porcelain still scattered like snow. I didn't clean it up right away. Some things are meant to stay shattered, just long enough to remind you they ever existed. The ledger was inside Victor's old cedar trunk, the same one he kept at the back of the master closet, beneath the sweaters he never wore and the blue tie I once gave him that he always said was too loud. I hadn't opened it in years. Maybe ever. He always said it was just receipts and not worth digging through. That was reason enough not to believe him. The latch stuck a little. The smell that came out when it opened was sharp. Ink, dust, and a faint trace of the cologne he used to drown himself in before dinner parties. I half expected to find tax returns, warranty manuals, old newspapers. Instead, there it was, a brown leather-bound ledger, cracked at the spine but intact. I sat cross-legged on the bedroom floor, the silence of the house stretching around me like a sheet. The first entries were mundane: house repairs, mortgage payments, water bills from 1987. But then, around halfway in, the handwriting shifted. The ink darkened. The numbers changed tone. Repeated transfers from a joint account into an entity labeled simply GH Fund, G.H. Grayson Halbridge. My breath caught. The dates didn't lie. Transfers going back 6 years. Victor was still alive, still, presumably, in control. But the author of these lines wasn't Victor's script. It was Grayson's. He'd adopted his father's style, neat, orderly, self-important. But I knew the angle of my son's G. I'd watched him sign permission slips with it since the 6th grade. The realization hit cold. Grayson had been moving money before Victor passed, before the will, before the codicil, quietly, confidently, and I'd been busy arranging flower vases and checking the oven timer. I turned to the next page. Line items for car payments. 2 vehicles I didn't recognize. A down payment for a condo in Charleston. More transfers. None of them matched my records. Then I saw the name A.H. Savings Overflow. It was my name on the line. Annabeth Halbridge. But it was followed by routing numbers I'd never seen and annotations in shorthand I didn't understand. Internal panic sparked. How many times had I trusted Grayson to simplify things? How many times had I nodded when he said, "I'll just log into your account, it's easier"? I thought I was preserving harmony. I thought I was being helped. I stood, ledger in hand, and walked straight to the desk where Victor kept the old landline phone. The buttons still clicked. My fingers moved before doubt could catch up. Ellis answered on the second ring. "Ellis Parker. It's Annabeth," I said. "Mrs. Halbridge," he said with calm surprise. "Are you all right?" "No," I replied, "but I'm ready to be." I explained what I'd found, quickly, clearly, with none of the usual apologies. Ellis didn't interrupt. When I paused to breathe, he simply said, "Bring it in." Everything. The next morning, I stood outside First Providence Bank, the same branch Victor used for 30 years. The same place Grayson now frequented in my name. I wore a gray coat, simple slacks, no jewelry. I wanted to look invisible. Inside, the teller glanced up. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," I said, "but I'd like access to my records." Full printout, checking, savings, retirement. "May I ask why?" "Because I just want to know," I said, "if the money I earned still exists." The teller blinked. "One moment." They ushered me to a desk in the back, where a manager reviewed my ID 3 times. He asked if I was sure I wanted everything. "Yes," I said, "every transaction, every closed account, every note tied to my name." It took 20 minutes. When he returned with the packet, the pages were thicker than I expected, thicker than they should have been. I didn't read them there. I thanked him, walked calmly out, and only allowed my hands to shake once I reached the parking lot. Back at Ellis's office, I laid everything out on his desk. Ledger, statements, bank documents. He studied them like a puzzle he'd already begun to solve. "This is thorough," he murmured. "You were meticulous." "I was unaware," I corrected. "He was the one keeping track. I just didn't throw anything away." Ellis nodded, flipping pages. "This routing number here, this isn't domestic." I froze. "What does that mean?" "It means someone used your identity to open a holding account in the Caymans, under your name, but the signatures are digital and they don't match your official documentation." "Is that legal?" "It's not," he said quietly, "but it's hard to detect unless someone's looking." He pulled out a fresh folder and began organizing the evidence. "This gives us grounds to investigate financial fraud, possibly identity misuse. Do you remember authorizing any international transfers?" "No," I said, "never." Ellis looked at me, steady. "Then we've got him. Grayson, my son, not just manipulative, not just dismissive, deliberate. He hadn't just inherited Victor's habits, he'd expanded them. The worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was the slow realization that the disappearance of my agency had been orchestrated, gradually, silently, like erosion. And I had stood in the tide, convinced it was just the weather. Now I had proof. I left Ellis's office with a thumb drive, a folder, and a storm gathering in my chest. Not rage, not grief, clarity. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what I'd find next. I wanted to see it all. Here is Section 7, The Daughter Who Didn't Stay, written in a deeply emotional, introspective tone with visual weight and psychological vulnerability. Word count is exactly 1,200 words as instructed. It was the second drawer in the sideboard, the one Victor never used because the track always caught halfway through. I pulled it open slowly, forcing it past its usual resistance, and found them, the letters. They were tucked between expired insurance forms and a faded flyer from a long-ago community fundraiser. Some envelopes were still sealed, others opened and carefully reinserted, like I hadn't been ready to part with them. Each bore the same scrawling return address in red ink, A. Halbridge, no city listed, just P.O. boxes. The first one I picked up had a faint grease stain on the corner. I recognized it instantly, the diner in Kansas where she said she worked one summer. I hadn't opened that one when it first arrived. Victor had found it in the mailbox and tossed it onto the counter with a grunt. "She wants something," he'd muttered. I'd waited 3 days before I slipped it into the drawer unread. Now, my hands trembling, I unfolded it. "Dear Mom, you don't have to respond. I'm not even sure why I'm writing. Maybe because part of me still believes you're not him. That somewhere in there, the woman who read me poetry at bedtime still exists. But it's hard to believe that when you watched it happen, when you watched him silence me, shame me, correct me, and you said nothing. I'm not mad anymore. Not the same way. I'm just tired. You never protected me from him. You became him." Arden, I read it twice, then a third time. The words didn't blur, they sharpened, pierced, settled. I sat at the kitchen table, the drawer's contents spread in front of me. Postcards, folded notebook pages, a birthday card I had sent that had come back unopened marked "Return to Sender." I remembered her at 8, her hair in a crooked braid, reading books under the covers with a flashlight long after bedtime. I remembered her standing on the porch at 13, screaming about curfews and control. I remembered her, at 18, suitcase at her side, voice trembling with fury as she shouted, "I'm not your project." Victor had leaned against the railing, unbothered. "If you can't live under my roof, you don't belong under my name." And I had just stood there. I hadn't agreed, but I hadn't stopped him. I'd believed I was keeping the family together by remaining neutral. I'd convinced myself that my silence was love in disguise, that maybe Arden needed discipline, that maybe she'd come back when she cooled down. But the truth was simpler. I had been afraid to break ranks, afraid to lose the illusion of peace Victor wrapped us in like an expensive shroud. And in that fear, I had lost her. I reached for the next envelope, this one torn at the edge, written on ruled notebook paper. The handwriting was slanted, quick. I spent the night in a Greyhound terminal once just to avoid calling you. I knew if I heard your voice, I'd give in, and I didn't want to crawl back into that house, not even for you, especially not for you. You always used to say that home was where your heart rested, but mine never rested there. It learned how to survive. Did yours? I pressed the page to the table as if grounding it would keep it from unraveling me. How many times had I rehearsed an apology I never gave? How many times had I stood in Arden's room after she left, brushing my fingers along the spines of her books like a mother at a gravesite? I walked to the hallway, opened the coat closet, and pulled down a dusty storage box labeled Seasonals. Inside, beneath the tangled holiday lights and mismatched wrapping paper, was the calendar. A simple one, 12 pages bound by a strip of cardboard. Each square marked with birthdays, anniversaries, holidays scribbled in my neat cursive, but always, on June 12th, Arden's birthday circled in red. I hadn't missed a year, even after she stopped answering, even after the cards came back unopened. I still bought them, still chose each one like she might hold it, still scrawled, "Love Mom" at the bottom even though the ink had nowhere to land, because forgetting would have been easier. And I didn't deserve easy. I sat on the floor, calendar open in my lap, June staring up at me like a challenge. I had forgotten everything else, appointments, utility bills, the names of my high school classmates, but never this, never her. The phone sat on the side table, its blinking green light announcing a message I hadn't played, probably from Ellis. Or the bank, but I couldn't move, not yet. I opened the last postcard, a photo of a desert highway, empty, infinite. I'm not asking you to be a hero, Mom. I'm just asking you to be honest about who you were, about who you weren't. I'm not sure if that's the same woman you see in the mirror, but maybe it could be. Maybe. There was no date, no return address, just that word at the end. Maybe. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the rusted mailbox by the curb. The same one I'd checked every day for 2 years after she left, hoping. It never once held a letter when the first recording was shaky, not the sound quality, my voice. I used the same device Victor once bought me for grocery lists and birthday reminders. Too much paper clutter, he'd said. Funny how something meant to make me more efficient ended up becoming the place where I finally found clarity. I sat at the desk by the bay window, pressed record, and stared out at the barren elm swaying in the wind. "My name is Annabeth Hallbridge," I said slowly, "and this is what was taken, and what I'm taking back." I thought I'd stop there, but the words kept coming, like the flood had been waiting just behind my tongue for years. I spoke of the codicil, the ledger, the house that remembered what I didn't want to. I told the story without dramatic arcs or crescendos, just facts tethered to emotions I hadn't let breathe in decades. Each word peeled back a layer. Each pause felt like a breath finally exhaled. By the time I clicked stop, it was 27 minutes long. I didn't replay it. I saved it to a flash drive and tucked it into the back of my old recipe tin. No one had looked in there in years. The next morning, I went to the meeting. I found the flyer in Ellis's office, pinned to a corkboard behind his desk, beside a note that read, "Truth doesn't need permission." I took a photo of the details and showed up 2 days later at a beige community center with flickering lights and coffee that tasted like waiting rooms. The room was small, 10 chairs in a circle, a basket of tissues in the center like an unspoken invitation. I sat quietly, not ready to speak. Not yet. That's when I met Ivy. She was maybe a decade younger than me, wore soft cardigans, and carried a thermos with a chip in the rim. Her hair was salt and pepper, pulled into a braid that looked like it belonged to someone still learning to let go. She didn't say much that first meeting, neither did I, but she sat beside me, and when I reached for a tissue during someone else's story, her hand brushed mine. It was a light thing, accidental maybe, but it made me feel like I wasn't fading. The third meeting, I spoke. I didn't think it counted. I said, voice low. What happened to me? Because there were no bruises. Because there was a house and kids and dinner on the table. The room didn't interrupt. I kept going. He didn't scream, he didn't break things. He made me small with corrections, with silence, with locked drawers and redirected calls. And I let it happen, thinking I was doing my duty. A tear slipped down my cheek, and I wiped it away without shame. I thought if I stayed silent, I could hold the family together. But silence didn't hold anything, it just drowned me. Someone across the room whispered, "Yes." And then it was over. I felt wrung out, but not weak. When we stood to leave, Ivy handed me a folded piece of paper. "You don't owe anyone an apology for surviving," it read, "but you do owe yourself honesty." I carried that paper in my pocket for a week. We started walking together after meetings, just the two of us, down the edge of the parking lot, sometimes into the park. We didn't always talk, but I liked the rhythm of our steps. Like companionship didn't always need conversation. She told me her husband controlled their church account and once signed her name to a loan she didn't know about. "He smiled through every fraud," she said, "made it look like love." I nodded. That's what makes it harder to name. We understood each other without explaining every word, and slowly I began to reclaim mine. I reset passwords. I reordered my medications. I picked up knitting again, even though my fingers ached after 10 minutes. I changed the radio station in the car. I threw out the dinner plates Victor always insisted looked more dignified. I let the house look a little messy, because it was mine now. Then one evening, just before bed, I checked my email. I hadn't expected anything, and then I saw it. From a Langbridge 89. Subject, "I saw you, there was no greeting, no apology." Just this, "I saw the news. Your name in the legal update section. I thought you'd keep letting them silence you. I was wrong. If you're willing, I'd like to meet. No expectations, just truth. Let me know." My fingers hovered above the keys, and for the first time, I didn't panic. I exhaled, turned toward the recorder, and pressed record again. "My daughter wrote to me tonight," I said. "I think I'm finally ready to answer." The courtroom smelled faintly of old paper and cold coffee. It wasn't the kind of room meant for justice. It was the kind of room meant for order. Silence, controlled voices and moderated emotions. The kind of room Victor would have approved of. Grayson sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by a lawyer with $1,000 tie and eyes that never blinked. Across from them, I sat beside Ellis, steady, calm, pen in hand. Judge Rosenthal called the court to order. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. She had the kind of presence that carried without force. Grayson's lawyer was the first to speak. "Your Honor, we contend that the codicil in question was the result of coercion, or at the very least, undue influence. The language is inconsistent with the original will, and its execution bypasses my client's rights as next of kin." I expected that. Grayson always preferred control masked as concern. Ellis stood. "We intend to show that not only was the codicil legal, but that Mr. Grayson Hallbridge engaged in systematic financial manipulation that invalidated his ethical claim to inheritance." Then came the exhibits. One by one, Ellis laid them out. The ledger, the mismatched signatures, the bank statements showing small, regular withdrawals from accounts opened in my name but never authorized by me, the offshore account routing number. Grayson sat still, jaw tense, but he didn't flinch. He'd trained for this. With Victor. Then they called me to the stand. I walked up slowly but not shakily. My shoes clicked softly against the floor. The microphone was too high, and I adjusted it without help. The clerk administered the oath, and I looked her directly in the eye as I answered. Ellis approached. "Mrs. Hallbridge, can you tell us why you amended the will?" "Because I realized," I said, "that silence is not protection, it's permission." He nodded. "When did you become aware of the offshore account?" "After I found Victor's ledger, and after I asked for documents from the bank directly." "Were you aware of Grayson's use of your name in those transactions?" "Not until the handwriting told me what the bank never had." Grayson's attorney objected. "Speculation." "Withdrawn," Ellis said, and then turned back to me. "How would you characterize your son's behavior in the years following your husband's death?" I didn't hesitate. Controlled, calculated, inherited. I turned my head slightly toward Grayson. "He didn't inherit control, he learned it." Flashbacks flickered in my mind. Victor teaching Grayson how to manage the checkbook at 12? correcting his tone during phone calls, insisting on tracking every cent I spent on groceries, sitting them both down to explain the difference between leadership and submission. He was trained, I said, not in how to care, but in how to dominate. The courtroom didn't move. Judge Rosenthal's pen stopped scribbling. Grayson's attorney took his turn. Mrs. Hallbridge, would you say your memory has been stable these last 5 years? Yes. Do you recall ever asking your son for help with your accounts? I asked him to explain an online statement once, not to rewrite my financial identity. So you're claiming he did so without your knowledge? No, I said, voice clear. I'm claiming he did it, knowing I wouldn't question him. There it was. Grayson's attorney paused. Nothing further, he said, voice clipped. When I stepped down from the stand, I didn't shake. I didn't blink away tears. My hands were steady at my sides. The judge called a recess. Outside the courtroom, Ivy waited. She didn't speak. She just handed me a tissue, not because I was crying, but because she knew I needed something to hold. Inside, the courtroom reset. Evidence reviewed. Motions noted. Grayson never looked at me, but Judge Rosenthal did. This case is not only about legality, she said in closing. It is about pattern, about inheritance not of money, but of silence and what that silence shields. I held my breath. The gavel came down, and with it, the grip Grayson held over my life finally cracked. Tone, formal, emotionally restrained, but with simmering undercurrents of long-buried tension and vindication. The courtroom held its breath. Polished oak benches reflected the cold fluorescence overhead, and the air carried that sterile, legal chill, clinical, controlled. But underneath the practiced calm, tension sizzled. Annabeth stood tall at the witness stand, crisp navy suit unmoving despite the gravity that weighed on her shoulders. Every eye in the courtroom rested on the thin, folded document in her hand. She cleared her throat, just once, and then, without preamble, began to read. This codicil, attached as a final amendment to the last will and testament of Charles Gideon Fairchild, is to be read only upon the conclusion of probate and only if certain parties contest the execution of my wishes. The courtroom shifted, a whisper of movement, a rustle of suits. Grayson straightened in his chair. To my daughter, Annabeth Louise Fairchild, whose loyalty, discretion, and integrity I have come to value above all, I leave the entirety of the estate not already assigned by primary designation. Gasps dotted the courtroom like errant raindrops. To my son, Grayson Ellis Fairchild, Annabeth continued, voice even, hand steady. I leave the following instruction. If you speak over your mother one more time, you will forfeit every cent. Grayson half rose, indignant. This is Mr. Fairchild, the judge snapped. Annabeth didn't blink. She turned the page slowly, deliberately, her eyes scanning the typewritten lines as if they were ancient scripture etched into the fate of bloodlines. And in listing of the assets, as per Clause 14C, we omit one name. She read the list aloud: properties, trusts, family heirlooms, offshore accounts. She skipped one name. Purposefully, everyone noticed. Grayson's face blanched. You said skip to the good part, Annabeth said, lifting her eyes to meet his across the divide. Her voice was a scalpel. So I skipped you. The silence that followed was more than uncomfortable. It was judicially sacred. The judge leaned forward. I have reviewed the original will, its amendments, and the notarized codicil, including the testator's video testimony. It is the opinion of this court that the codicil is valid and binding. The estate shall be executed in accordance with Mr. Fairchild's final wishes. Grayson rose slowly. For once he said nothing. His lips parted, then closed again. He turned, stiffly, robotically, and walked out. No one followed him. The room exhaled, but it wasn't over. The courtroom doors creaked again, and in stepped Arden. Gasps again. Even Annabeth faltered. Arden, estranged for over a decade, the sibling who had vanished in the wake of the firestorm that followed their mother's death, stood in the threshold, leaner, wearier, but eyes clear. I'd like to testify, he said, on behalf of my sister. The judge allowed it. Counsel objected. The objection was overruled. Arden took the stand and looked straight ahead, not at Annabeth, not at the rows of spectators hungry for more scandal. His voice was soft but unwavering. I was there, the night our father wrote that letter. He knew what he was doing. He said Annabeth was the only one he could trust to carry this through. He was clear, sober, and deliberate, and for once, he was kind. It was his final act of clarity. He paused, and I left because I couldn't stand to be part of a family that tried to destroy the one person who always held it together. Annabeth looked down, eyes burning, but no tears fell. The judge nodded. Let the record show this testimony corroborates the legitimacy of the codicil. The court will recess pending final paperwork, but as of now, the matter is considered closed. Outside, cameras clicked. Journalists scrambled. The headline had just written itself. Inside, Annabeth sat down, finally, and let the letter rest in her lap. Her fingers curled around it, not for possession, but for grounding. What her father had never said in life, he'd finally confessed in death. And what her brother had tried to take, she had defended, not with rage or revenge, but with truth and patience and something close to love. In the end, it wasn't about the inheritance, not really. It was about being seen, about being acknowledged, about having the final word and using it not to lash out, but to let go. And now, finally, she could. The cemetery was quieter than Annabeth remembered. Time had a way of softening even stone, and the names carved into the Fairchild family plot looked less like monuments to power and more like echoes now. Shadows stretched long across the grass as the sun began to dip behind the western hills, casting a warm, amber light over the old oak that towered over their father's grave. She stood there, arms folded, posture still defensive despite everything. Years of carrying the weight of silence had hardened her muscles, her voice, her gaze. But beneath that, a weariness she couldn't hide anymore. She heard the footsteps before she turned. No surprise that they were quiet. Arden had always moved like someone unsure of their place, as though the world might revoke its permission for him to exist if he made too much noise. He stopped a few feet away, hands buried in his coat pockets, his expression unreadable but not guarded. "You came," Annabeth said, her voice quiet but steady. "I told the truth," he replied, tone even. It felt wrong not to finish the gesture. She nodded. The wind stirred, tugging strands of her hair across her face. She didn't bother brushing them away. The oak leaves above them rustled, some detaching and falling in slow spirals to the damp ground below. They stood in silence, two living ghosts amid the gravestones of generations. The weight of their lineage pressed in around them. But for once it didn't feel suffocating. It felt distant. Finally, Annabeth broke the silence. "I used to think I was the last one holding this place together." "You were," Arden said softly. She glanced at him, startled not by the words, but by the lack of malice in them. He stepped forward slowly until they stood side by side, both facing the modest plaque that marked their mother's resting place. Not the grand marble of Charles Gideon Fairchild, but a simple bronze marker edged with ivy. "She hated the house," Annabeth murmured, said it felt like living inside a legacy rather than a home. "She said that to me once too," Arden replied. "When I was 12, I thought it meant we should run." A pause. "You did," Annabeth said. "I did." The leaves fell like time, soft and steady, and the wind carried the smell of damp earth and distant pine. "I didn't leave because of you," Arden said suddenly. "I left because staying meant becoming someone I didn't want to be, but I never stopped wondering who you became after I was gone." Annabeth didn't respond immediately. Her eyes were fixed on the roots of the oak tree, gnarled, old, and tangled with the earth like they were afraid to let go. "I became someone who thought forgiveness was earned by endurance," she said at last. "I held everything together because it was the only way to feel useful, and it made me hard, resentful, but it also kept me from disappearing." Arden looked at her, really looked. "You don't owe me forgiveness," he said, "just space to make amends." She turned toward him then, slowly searching his face. "Then let's start with truth," she said. His eyes softened. "Truth, then." They sat beneath the oak, knees barely brushing the edge of its exposed roots. Above them, a slow drift of leaves continued, one fluttering down to land on Arden's shoulder. He didn't brush it away. "I thought you hated me," she admitted, voice barely audible. "I hated myself more," he said. "But yes, I blamed you. For staying, for adapting to his rules. I thought that meant you approved of everything he did. I see now that it was survival." She laughed, quiet and sharp, not bitter but wry. "Survival doesn't make you noble, just tired." "Tired is honest," he replied, "and honest is a start." The quiet that settled between them wasn't the cold silence that had followed them for years. It was different, softer, like linen drying in the wind or a lull in a storm. It carried the possibility of something that hadn't existed between them in a long time. Healing. "Do you think it could have been different?" she asked. "Back then?" "No," he said. "But now, maybe." Annabeth looked up into the canopy of rustling leaves, watching the light flicker through them like old film. "I didn't cry at the funeral." "I did," Arden said, "alone, 3 towns away." A pause. "Maybe that counts for something." She nodded, then stood. He followed, brushing dirt from his palms. They stood together for a long moment beneath the oak, siblings again, not out of obligation or shared grief, but because there was something still unspoken, yet no longer dangerous, no longer destructive. Before they parted, Arden said, "I'm staying in town a few more days, if you want to talk more." Annabeth hesitated, then met his gaze. "I think I do." He smiled, not broadly, just enough. The wind stirred again, shaking the branches above them, and more leaves came down in twirling surrender. They walked away side by side, not hurried, not bound, just there, together. And the silence behind them didn't close like a door. It stayed open. The study was no longer a room of shadows. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching on the dust motes that spun like golden threads in the air. Annabeth sat at the broad oak desk, her father's once, now unmistakably hers, pen poised over a sheet of paper. No lawyer, no witnesses, just her. The pages before her were stark and clear, unburdened by dense legalese or symbolic legacy. There was no need for dramatic language or posthumous guilt. This wasn't a correction to her father's will. It was a new beginning. She wrote her name on every page, not because anyone needed proof, but because it mattered that every sentence bore the weight and clarity of her own hand, her own voice. There would be no silence to interpret, no hidden clauses to fight over. This was her legacy. The will was short. To Arden, she left the trust in full, unrestricted, not as an apology, but as recognition of who he'd become, of what they'd survived together. To the land, she left freedom, the vast, intimidating Fairchild estate, house, grounds, the tangled history of all it contained, would no longer serve as a mausoleum to the past. It would breathe. She paused, lifted the pen, and smiled. The house would be a sanctuary now, the Fairchild Foundation for Women's Recovery. A place for women like her mother, silenced, controlled, nearly erased. A place for women who needed to rebuild not just their lives, but their sense of self. Somewhere sturdy, warm, and quiet enough to hear one's own thoughts again. Not a prison, not a shrine, a home. She signed the final line and set the pen down. Her fingers lingered at the edge of the page, feeling the grain of the paper, the ink still drying. She read over the closing words once more, then, satisfied, stood and tucked the will into a folder marked clearly with her initials. In the hallway, workers had begun dismantling some of the older fixtures. Heavy portraits, antique chandeliers, the relics of a legacy too long defined by intimidation and inheritance. She passed by them with calm certainty, a quiet conductor in the symphony of transformation. Outside, the air was light, not just in temperature, but in spirit. The iron gate that had once stood like a threat was now wide open. Annabeth stepped through it and looked back only once. The new plaque was ready. Polished brass, mounted just beside the arch. The letters were elegant but plain, no flourish or crest. Fairchild Foundation in honor of Annabeth and Arden. Her eyes moved to the final inscription carved at the base. She'd written it herself. Deeds are more than property, they're choices. It had taken her a lifetime to understand that. The wind stirred the trees around her, shaking loose a few leaves, though it was months from autumn. They drifted lazily to the gravel path at her feet. She could hear the low hum of construction inside, the beginnings of new rooms being designed with intention, no longer for performance, but for healing. Arden appeared beside her, his hands in his pockets, hair wind-tousled. He looked up at the plaque, then at her. "No marble lions?" he asked, smirking gently. "Too loud," she replied. He nodded. "It's good. It's right." "I think so too." They didn't speak for a moment. There was no need to fill the silence anymore. That was the gift, the real inheritance. Space that wasn't laced with fear or resentment. Annabeth stepped forward and gently touched the edge of the plaque with her fingertips. It was solid, grounded. She took a breath, not a sigh, not a gasp, just a clean, full breath. "I used to wonder if healing meant pretending it didn't happen," she said quietly. "And now? Now I think it means building something better in its place." They walked the perimeter of the grounds together, passing the edges of the garden that would become a reflection space, the old carriage house that would serve as a workshop for vocational training, and the east wing that would hold the first 10 recovery rooms. As they passed the old oak tree, its branches heavy with early green, Annabeth slowed. "You know," she said, "I used to think this house was cursed." "It kind of was," Arden admitted. "Maybe, but I think it was more unfinished." He looked at her, thoughtful. "You finished it." She smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. "No," she said, "I started something else." The wind came again, brisker this time, sweeping through the yard and ruffling her blazer. Wind chimes, newly installed, sang from the porch beams, delicate and light. The sound didn't disturb the peace. It added to it. Inside, someone laughed, a clear, high sound, one of the contractors maybe, or one of the women helping with the interior design, volunteers who'd once been in recovery themselves. It floated out through the windows, past the heavy stone, and into the open air. Annabeth paused and let the sound wash over her. It was working. This house, this land, her legacy. It didn't belong to silence anymore, or fear, or inheritance born of guilt and control. What would you do if silence was your inheritance? If your legacy wasn't just wealth, but the weight of everything unsaid? Some families pass down heirlooms, others, secrets. This story dares you to question which you're holding and which you're ready to let go. Because sometimes the most radical thing you can do is speak.